25 more caught hold of her left arm and pinned that down. 25 caught hold of her right leg and anchored it to the ground. 24 caught hold of her left leg, and the one remaining squirrel, obviously the leader of them all, climbed up onto her shoulder and started tapping the wretched girl's head with its knuckles. "Save her!" screamed Mrs. Salt. "Veruca, come back! What are they doing to her?" "They're testing her to see if she's a bad nut," said Mr. Wonka. "You watch." Veruca struggled furiously, but the squirrels held her tight, and she couldn't move. The squirrel on her shoulder went tapping the side of her head with its knuckles. Then all at once, the squirrels pulled Veruca to the ground and started carrying her across the floor. "My goodness, is she a bad nut after all?" said "My goodness, she is a bad nut after all," said Mr. Wonka. Her head must have sounded quite hollow. Veruca kicked and screamed, but it was no use. The tiny, strong paws held her tightly, and she couldn't escape. "Where are they taking her?" shrieked Mrs. Salt. "She's going where all the other bad nuts go," said Mr. Wonka. "Down the garbage chute." "By golly, she is going down the chute," said Mr. Salt, staring through the glass at his daughter. "Then save her!" cried Mrs. Salt. "Too late," said Mr. Wonka. "She's gone." And indeed she had. "But where?" shrieked Mrs. Salt, flapping her arms. "What happens to the bad nuts? Where does the chute go?" "That particular chute," Mr. Wonka told her, "runs directly into the great big main garbage pipe, which carries away all the rubbish from every part of the factory, all the floor sweepings and potato peelings and rotten cabbages and fish heads and stuff like that." "Who eats fish and cabbage and potatoes in this factory, I'd like to know," said Mike Teavee. "I do, of course," answered Mr. Wonka. "You don't think I live on cocoa beans, do you?" But, shrieked Mrs. Salt, "where does the great big pipe go in the end?" "Why, to the furnace, of course," Mr. Wonka said calmly, "to the incinerator." Mrs. Salt opened her huge red mouth and started to scream. "Don't worry," said Mr. Wonka. "There's always a chance that they've decided not to light it today." "A chance!" yelled Mrs. Salt. "My darling Veruca, she'll sizzle like a sausage." "Quite right, my dear," said Mr. Salt. "Now, see here, Wonka, I think you've gone just a shade too far this time. I do indeed. My daughter may be a bit of a frump, I don't mind admitting it, but that doesn't mean you can roast her to a crisp. I'll have you know I'm extremely cross about this. I am. I really am." "Oh, don't be cross, my dear sir," said Mr. Wonka. "I'll expect she'll turn up again sooner or later. She might not even gone down at all. She may be stuck in the chute just below the entrance hole. And if that's the case, all you'll have to do is go in and pull her up again." Hearing this, both Mr. and Mrs. Salt dashed into the nut room and ran over to the hole in the floor and peered in. "Veruca," shouted Mrs. Salt, "are you down there?" There was no answer. Mrs. Salt bent further forward to get a closer look. She was now kneeling right on the edge of the hole with her head down and an enormous behind sticking up in the air like a giant mushroom. It was a dangerous position to be in. She needed only one little tiny push, one gentle nudge in the right place, and that is exactly what the squirrels gave her, and she toppled into the hole head first, screeching like a parrot. "Good gracious me," said Mr. Salt as he watched his fat wife go tumbling down the hole. "What a lot of garbage there's going to be today." He saw her disappearing into the darkness. "What's it like down there, Angina?" he called out. He leaned further forward. The squirrels rushed up behind him. "Help!" he shouted, but he was already toppling forward. Down the chute he went, just as his wife had done before him and his daughter. "Oh dear," cried Charlie, who was watching with the others through the door. "What on earth's going to happen to them now?" "I expect someone will catch them at the bottom of the chute," said Mr. Wonka. "But what about the fiery incinerator?" asked Charlie. "They only light it every other day, Mr. Wonka. Perhaps this is one of the days when they will let it go out. You never know. They might be lucky." "Shh," said Grandpa Joe. "Listen. Here comes another song." From far away down the corridor came the beating of drums. Then the singing began. "Veruca Salt," sang the Oompa Loompas. "Veruca Salt, the little brute, has just gone down the garbage chute." And as we very rightly thought, that in this case like this is we ought. That in a case like this we ought to see the thing completely through. We've polished off her parents too. Down goes Veruca down the drain, and here perhaps we should explain that she will meet as she descends a rather different set of friends to those that she has left behind. These won't be nearly so refined. A fish head, for example, cut this morning from a halibut. Hello, good morning, how'd you do? How nice to meet you, how are you? And then a little further down, a mass of others gathered round. A bacon rind, some rancid lard, a loaf of bread gone stale and hard, a steak that nobody could chew, an oyster from an oyster stew, some liver's worst, so old and gray, one smelled it from a mile away, a rotten nut, a reeky pear, a thing the cat left out on the stair, and lots of other things as well, each with a rather horrid smell. These are Veruca's newfound friends that she will meet as she descends, and this is the price she has to pay for going so very far astray. But now, my dears, we think you might be wondering if it's really right that every single bit of blame and all the scolding and the shame should fall upon Veruca Salt. Is she the only one at fault? For though she's spoiled and dreadfully so, a girl can't spoil herself, you know. Who spoiled her then? Ah, who indeed? Who pandered to her every need? Who turned her into such a brat? Who are the culprits? Who did that? Alas, you needn't look so far to find out who these sinners are. They are, and this is very sad, her loving parents, mom and dad, and that is why we're glad they fell into the garbage chute as well. "25. The Great Glass Elevator." "I've never seen anything like it," cried Mr. Wonka. "The children are disappearing like rabbits, but you mustn't worry about it. They'll all come out in the wash." Mr. Wonka looked at the little group that stood beside him in the corridor. There were only 2 children left now, Mike TV and Charlie Bucket, and there were 3 grown-ups, Mr. and Mrs. TV and Grandpa Joe. "Shall we move on?" Mr. Wonka said. "Oh, yes," cried Charlie and Grandpa Joe both together. "My feet are getting tired," said Mike TV. "I want to watch television." "If you're tired, then we'd better take the elevator," said Mr. Wonka. "It's over here. Come on, in we go." He skipped across the passage to a pair of double doors. The doors slid open. The 2 children and grown-ups went in. "Now then," cried Mr. Wonka, "which button shall we press first? Take your pick." Charlie Bucket stared around at him in astonishment. This was the craziest elevator he had ever seen. There were buttons everywhere. The walls and even the ceiling were all covered with rows and rows and rows of small black push buttons. There must have been 1,000 of them on each wall and another 1,000 on the ceiling. And now Charlie noticed that every single button had a tiny printed label beside it telling you which room you would be taken to if you pressed it. "This isn't just any ordinary up and down elevator," pronounced Mr. Wonka. "This elevator can go sideways and long ways and slant ways and any other way you can think of. It can visit any single room in the whole factory, no matter where it is. You simply press the button and zing, you're off." "Fantastic," murmured Grandpa Joe. His eyes were shining with excitement as he stared at the rows and rows of buttons. "The whole elevator is made of thick, clear glass," Mr. Wonka declared. "Walls, doors, ceiling, floor, everything made of glass so that you can see out." "But there's nothing to see," said Mike Tivy. "Choose a button," said Mr. Wonka. "The 2 children may press 1 button each. So take your pick. Hurry up. In every room something delicious and wonderful is being made." Quickly Charlie started reading some of the labels alongside the buttons. "Rock Candy Mine, 10,000 feet deep," it said on one. "Coconut Ice Skating Rinks," it said on another. Then "Strawberry Juice Water Pistols, Toffee Apple Trees for planting out in your garden, all sizes. Exploding candy for your enemies. Luminous lollies for eating in bed at night. Mint jujubes for the boy next door. They'll give him green teeth for a month. Cavity filling caramels, no more dentist. Stick jaw for a talkative parent. Wriggle sweets that wriggle delightfully in your tummy after swallowing. Invisible chocolate bars for eating in class. Candy coated pencils for sucking. fizzy lemonade swimming pools, magic hand fudge. When you hold it in your hand, you taste it in your mouth. Rainbow drops, suck them and you can spit in 6 different colors. Come on, cried Wonka. We can't wait all day. Isn't there a television room in all this lot? Asked Mike Teavee. Certainly there's a television room, Mr. Wonka said. That button over there. He pointed with his fingers. Everybody looked. Television chocolate, it said on the tiny label beside the button. Whoopee, shouted Mike Teavee. That's for me. He stuck out his thumb and pressed the button. Instantly there was a tremendous whizzing noise. The doors clanged shut, and the elevator leaped away as though it had been stung by a wasp. But it leapt sideways. All the passengers except Mr. Wonka, who was holding on to a strap from the ceiling, were flung off their feet onto the floor. Get up, cried Mr. Wonka, roaring with laughter. But just as they were staggering to their feet, the elevator changed directions and swerved violently around a corner, and over they went once more. Help, shouted Mrs. Teavee. Take my hand, madam, said Mr. Wonka gallantly. There you are. Now grab this strap. Everybody grab a strap. The journey is not over yet. Oh, Grandpa Joe staggered to his feet and caught a hold of a strap. Little Charlie, who couldn't possibly reach that high as that, put his arms around Grandpa Joe's legs and hung on tight. The elevator rushed on at a speed of rocket. Now it was beginning to climb. It was shooting up and up and up on a steep, slanty course, as if it were climbing a very steep hill. Then suddenly, as though it had come to the top of a hill and gone over a precipice, it dropped like a stone, and Charlie felt his tummy coming right up into his throat, and Grandpa Joe shouted, Yippee, here we go! And Mrs. Teavee cried out, the rope has broken, we're going to crash. And Mr. Wonka said, calm yourself, my dear lady, and patted her comfortedly on the arm. And then Grandpa Joe looked down at Charlie, who was clinging to his leg, and he said, are you all right, Charlie? Charlie shouted, I love it, it's like being on a roller coaster. And through the glass walls of the elevator, as it rushed along, they caught a glimpse of a strange and wonderful things going on in some of the other rooms. An enormous spout with brown sticky stuff oozing out of it onto the floor. A great craggy mountain made entirely of fudge, with Oompa Loompas all roped together for safety, hacking huge hunks of fudge out of its sides. A machine with white powder spraying out of it like a snowstorm. A lake of hot caramel with steam coming off of it. A village of Oompa Loompas with tiny houses and trees and hundreds of Oompa Loompas children no more than 4 inches high playing in the streets. And now the elevator began flattening out again, but it seemed to be going faster than ever, and Charlie could hear the scream of the wind outside as it hurled forward, and it twisted and it turned, and it went up, it went down, and I'm going to be sick, yelled Mrs. Teavee, turning green in the face. Please don't be sick, said Mr. Wonka. Try and stop me, said Mrs. Teavee. Then you'd better take this, said Mr. Wonka. And he swept his magnificent top hat off his head and held it out upside down in front of Mrs. Teavee's mouth. Make this awful thing stop, ordered Mr. Teavee. I can't do that. It won't stop till we get there. I only hope no one's using the other elevator at this moment. What other elevator? Screamed Mrs. Teavee. The one that goes the opposite way on the same track of this one. Holy mackerel, cried Mr. Teavee. You mean we might have a collision? I've always been lucky so far, said Mr. Wonka. Now I'm going to be sick, yelled Mrs. Teavee. No, no, said Mr. Wonka, not now. We're nearly there. Don't spoil my hat. The next moment there was a screaming of brakes and the elevator began to slow down, then it stopped altogether. Some ride, said Mr. Teavee, wiping his great sweaty face with a handkerchief. Never again, gasped Mrs. Teavee, and then the doors of the elevator slid open, and Mr. Wonka said, just a minute now. Listen to me. I want everybody to be careful in this room. There is dangerous stuff around here, and you must not tamper with it.